And now we are on top of the hour, so I think we can start. Welcome everyone to this core working group meeting at IETF 113, hybrid after 2 years or so. It's nice to be here and I've seen you again on site. I am Marco Tiloca. My co-chairs are Jaime Jimenez and Karsten Bormann. You can find in this cover slide also a new resource for the working group, the Zulip stream. So, of course, as usual, you assume people to have read the documents to be discussed today and in the agenda. Please do your best to use the allocated time in the best possible way to discuss issues that benefit from face-to-face discussion. The not well applies, and a slide comes later. The blue sheets is collected automatically through Miteco. Karsten will mostly pay attention to the chat and Jabber, and we have Rika Höglund that volunteered to take notes. Thank you very much. Anyone is welcome to help him out. And of course, this is an official IETF meeting that not well applies. Please get familiar with that if you're not already. It's not about IPR and patents. It's also and especially about our code of conduct. So be nice and professional with one another. Right, we are on Friday, so probably you have seen this many times and you are masters of this already, but the meeting is recording and it works in a particular way for in-person attendees. You have to be signed in Miteco to be able to build a single queue for the chairs to manage and to be counted in the blue sheets and so on. You can do that using the light version from the agenda and the data tracker. If you still want to use the full version, please keep audio and video off. And as to join the queue, you have to join the queue on Miteco first of all, before going to the mic. For remote participants, it's worked pretty much like it has worked in the last 2 years. If you cannot use audio at all, just type mic on the chat to explore relaying your question. All right, this is the agenda for today. It's pretty packed, so please try to stay on time. Chairs will help out, be sure that happens. We start with a bunch of working group documents in the first half of the meeting, meaning href, conditional attributes, group communication for co-op or group combis, and then the group OSCORE document, and the key update for OSCORE on Kudos document, and then we continue with 3 non-working group documents, transport indication, non-traditional responses, and DNS over co-op. Before we continue, is there any agenda bashing that anyone wants to propose? Here and seeing none. Then moving on, an usual update on the document status and the working group. So double reason to celebrate. In the recent weeks, we have 2 documents published as RFC. 9175 that used to be echo request tag. Thank you very much, as usual, to the authors and the working group for this. And a few days ago, only also 9177 was published and used to be a new block. Thank you very much for this too. Awesome, yes. And similar news should come anytime soon about 2 other documents that are still in the RFC queue, but one is Auth48 done, even as an ML data CT, and the resource directory is in Auth48 and waiting for very final touches, as far as I know, before it can proceed for publication. We have 2 documents in ISG processing, Young Cibor and SID. So Young Cibor is really almost there. There is one more comment to be addressed, and all should be concluded next week. And for SID, there has been a lot of discussion also in a side meeting yesterday between authors and AD on a final discussed ballot to be addressed. This requires some more text to be added, but that should happen also very soon. All right, and then a bunch of documents post-working group last call, meaning the other 2 documents of the core-conf clusters that are just waiting for the first 2 ones I've just mentioned before they can actually go under Shepherd write-up. And then we have the Grupo score document that has passed the second working Grupo score and should be ready to move on, but we have a presentation about it later today. And that's all for the document status, unless there are any questions, comments on that. Then we can start with the actual presentation, and that's on Karsten for href.
Okay. So this will just be a quick status update. The draft is called href. The subject of the draft is the CRI, the Concise Resource Identifier, which is essentially a concise equivalent of the URIs.
Karsten, sorry to interrupt. Your mic is pretty noisy. It worked better when you tested it. Maybe it's just
noisy
distance.
As in?
Almost breaking up.
Yeah, okay, that will be my internet access. This is provided by German Telecom.
Okay, still understandable. Let's try.
That's ugly. Okay. Yeah, just tell me when I'm no longer intelligible. So the idea is that the URIs and URI references, which we love so much, actually have an underlying data model that just has to be discovered, and we can provide a concise representation format for that. So that's the point of this draft. This has been originally started by Klaus Hartke, and right now we are just trying to finish that. And there have been a few updates since the last IETF. -08 was the IETF 112 version where we had added percent encoded text. And there have been a few tweaks to that in -09. We also did an editorial step by moving all the weird stuff into an appendix, the small print appendix that you probably only have to read if you're actually implementing this. And in -10, we finally added the last URI component that we so far hadn't supported, the user info structure. This is the thing that comes in an @ sign before the host name, and that is really bad if there is a password included. So that feature is not part of -10, but the user info itself is occasionally being used. So this is now also possible to represent, and a few more editorial changes, and we also have a separate CDDL rule for both CRI and CRI reference, because in many cases you really just want CRIs, and so you don't need the full CRI reference production. What's ongoing right now is implementation work. So there are 4 implementations that I'm aware of in 4 different languages. And well, if you implement something, you uncover little issues. So this is exactly what's happening right now. And in the process, we are also expanding our collection of test vectors. So there will be a collection that all these implementations support, and that new implementers can use as a reference to test their implementations. But really, the objective of the implementation is to exercise CRI in a number of contexts. And that's, of course, Coral, which is what CRI originally was developed for, but also in the context of various data formats that use queries. And we need to make sure that these work well with CRIs, which is not too easy because queries are really just a syntactical hack on URIs. So they do not map to the data model at all. So we have to provide some help for that. And that is, of course, also in the context of CBOR Pact, where we want to make sure that the CIS can work well with CBOR Pact. Okay, and finally, where we are, we have 5 remaining issues on the repository. We have 1 PR on the text of the document. We also have 2 more PRs on the test vectors. I think that's maybe something the implementers can decide among themselves. But the other things really could use help from the working group. So if you occasionally maybe can look into the core working group href repository, maybe watch it so you find out about new issues and comment there, that would be really helpful. My personal estimate would be that we probably need about 6 more weeks to do this implementation work, and then maybe 1 more interim before we actually can get all these niggly little issues nailed down as well. So look into the issues list on GitHub to see what these niggly issues are. Yeah, we are no longer having really big questions, but the small ones need to be answered as well. So that's my summary.
Thank you, Carsten. Any questions, comments? Okay, do you plan an actual revision submitted in about 6 weeks or so? Or even some discussion before that happens?
Well, 1 or 2 revisions until we are done with the implementation testing. And then maybe we can do another revision after the interim.
Sounds good. Okay, seeing no questions in the chat, no one in the queue. I think we're done with href. Thank you, Carsten.
Thank you.
Okay, next on the agenda is Bill. Hi, Bill.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, very well.
Thank you. Yeah, I might have some audio trouble, so if you suddenly see my audio cutting off, then
Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna start video. I hope it's coming through.
Yes.
Okay, and see
Hi.
you. Hello, everybody in Vienna and remote. Couldn't join you this time, but I hope to do that next time. So I'm gonna share slides now.
It's coming up.
Please let me know if you can see this.
We can see them. Go ahead.
Good. So everything is good to go. All right. So again, good morning, everybody. It's a very small presentation that I have. So this is about the conditional attributes draft for core, and this is just delta from what had happened from the last interim meeting. So the last interim meeting, we actually resolved a lot of issues. At the moment, there are no more GitHub issues. And there was some resolution made on the value of the band attribute. We included some text about the proxy considerations inside the implementation considerations part. There is security considerations done. But then during the last interim, we actually had a small chat about what more could be done in this draft before it goes for working group last call. So this is what I'm here for. Firstly, there was a request that perhaps the term attributes or conditional attributes could be explained a little bit better and perhaps put into its own section. But considering the whole draft is about attributes, it felt a bit weird. So I update the introduction of the draft so that I try to clarify what conditional attributes are. So the old specification defined conditional attributes as just providing fine-grained control of notification and state synchronization with core observe, and there was some artifact about resource interfaces, blah, blah, blah. And then there was saying that a resource marked as observable in its link description should support these conditional attributes. So I recrafted that text, and initially I basically put that this is for use with call observe, but also it's how do you actually convey the conditional attributes. So using the query component of a co-op URI, and it can be either name value query parameter, or then just a name without a value, and we are able to essentially describe the resource using multiple conditional attributes. Please let me know if that is not okay. I hope it's okay. And that this is already in the current working group. No, sorry, the current editor's draft. It hasn't gone into the newest version. Once everything is done, once we are good with this, then I will resubmit the new version. Hopefully that will be the last one before working group last call. So this is basically the let's say the last editorial change I'd like to do. One more thing that came up in the interim meeting was the fact of whether we need a registry, and what kind of registry does this draft require. So in the inner constitution section, I had originally included in the last version of the draft conditional attributes registry to uniquely map these names to what they really are. But then the discussions came about whether this is necessary and what kind of registry we should have. There was some discussion about whether there's what the pros and cons. So obviously, it would be nice to have a registry to remove the ambiguity of how these can be defined. And the direct, let's say, implication of this is that some of these names are used in different contexts in different places. So for example, LT is used in the conditional attributes draft to mean less than, but then LT is used in the query parameters, I think, in the resource directory to mean lifetime. Resource directory actually already defines a sub registry for RD parameters to describe LT as lifetime. So that's one thing that I'd like to resolve today. Obviously, I don't really mind going forward that the draft never actually had a registry before, but it would be great to get some resolution on this. And also the discussion was whether it makes sense to have a more general attributes registry, but the one caveat to this is I'd like to just quote RFC 8820 to describe why we should not be doing that, because we don't want to usurp the use of these attributes in other kinds of other clients that may not necessarily be using this. So and then specifying more elaborate structures to avoid these collisions is not really an acceptable solution. So it's if we go generic, then I feel that perhaps it will really complicate matters. But on the other hand, I know that there are experts in our group who probably will know how to deal with this better than I do. So this is why I'd like to put this to the floor today, have a discussion about that, and then take this forward and hopefully resolve it so quickly that we can go to the last call. So that's all I have actually for today. So please, if anybody has any comments.
Let's go ahead.
Yeah, I just thought about this, especially this example of LT. Yeah, I think if it's used in a particular context, like resource directory, should be no problem that it's reused for something else, right, in another context. So you cannot rule that out, that it will happen in this way.
Mm.
So that seems to be fine, although it's of course better to look at what others use and then try to use more in conventions where possible.
Yep. So I agree with that. I think that it's a good. In my opinion, my personal preference will be to introduce a new subregistry for conditional attributes specifically for this purpose, without impinging on the use of the same attribute space in our query parameter names in other applications. I think it's clearer, but if the rest of you feel that perhaps a registry is not needed, then we can easily omit that as well in the draft and then move this forward. Christian, are you on the queue? Or if Esko hasn't, yeah, all right, Christian.
Yeah, Christian, I'm just I'd just like to kind of, I don't have a particular opinion on whether a registry structure makes sense, but I would like to point out that just because the one thing is used for observations and one is the resource directory doesn't mean that they might not overlap, because especially as it is phrased now, with everything that is observable should support the attributes. A lot of things in the resource directory are observable, not particularly used with the less than and lifetime, but in general, you can find things in the resource directory and then look it up. So these things might easily need to be combined.
Are you, Christian, could I trouble you to say that, did you just imply that when you say these things might need to be combined, are you implying a common subregistry for both? Because that would require some considerable thinking if LT is used, for example, even live with end-to-end already. So
I don't know whether a common sub, if you go for actually registered things, then probably doing this across applications makes sense. But that might also be a point why not doing a registry in the first place would be a thing to consider. But then these things would be combined like by the particular by a server, and then the server could just not combine this and that component just because they have overlap conflicting requirements. So maybe that a registry would also not be something that is completely normative, in the sense that as soon as one of these elements shows up, these semantics are implied, but more something for coordination between components, where each component would still, where the particular arguments would still, the semantics would be opted in by the extension, for example, resource directory or conditional attributes, but just seeing which names are in use allows the authors of these extensions to make a more informed decision on which names may not make sense to use here because they might get into conflict with something else. So it's not a registry that has, where as soon as you see the name, it has a meaning, but more when you want to pick a name, then you may look there and see where there is no conflict yet.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Esko, your audio is still on. Do you want to say something? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to react on that. So, yeah, I think the example that Christian mentioned shows that there is a kind of real risk of clashing of these attributes, especially if the draft now says that any observable resource should support these attributes. Maybe the resource is already supporting other attributes, and there could well be a clash, of course, in the names of those. So that's something to consider. I think if it's a resource like something like a temperature value that doesn't support any other attributes, then it's fine to apply those conditional attributes. But if it's something like indeed a resource directory resource that's already using attributes with same names, maybe for something something else, then you immediately have a problem if you want to combine those things. And I don't think you can actually apply all the conditional attributes in that case. So maybe that requires some thought if there's a way to resolve that, or maybe it's possible to, while discovering resources, to see if a resource supports the conditional attributes or not. that would also be great, but I'm not sure if that's already defined.
Well, I mean, the draft does not say that you must support these attributes. It just says you should.
Yeah.
So you don't necessarily need to have that collision at all.
But the client needs to know probably, as like, are these attributes supported or not? Yeah, before trying.
It's usually, I think for observe, it's usually best effort. You don't necessarily need to know that. I mean, it's just like for example, if you try to set pmin or pmax, it's kind of like a request to the server, so the server can choose to ignore that. We don't necessarily need to
Yeah, okay. So
enforce it. Yeah.
could be ignored, so you get more. Basically, the idea is if it somehow fails, you get more notifications than you
Yeah.
ask for,
Yeah.
and that's then the fallback situation.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
At least if the server accepts that, so it could also respond with an error, of course, if it doesn't know those new attributes.
Mm.
So that's why I said maybe it's good to have it potentially also discoverable whether the resource supports these new attributes or not. If there's a way
Yes.
to do that, so I think core discovery has some various ways to mark, like an interface you can mark for the resource, so it supports this particular interface, for example. That could be a way, but yeah, that's just a thought. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Karsten?
So, of course, there's also the problem of forward compatibility here. So if an application already uses foo and then we register foo, we have a problem. So one way to reduce that likelihood would be to define a namespace for conditional attributes. So anything that starts CA dot or CA dash is something that sensible application wouldn't use because it might be used for a conditional attribute. I'm not sure I'm suggesting this, but I want to bring it up as a way to make forward compatibility more likely.
Yeah. So actually, that's the reason why I put that sub bullet point that this namespace issue was not was discouraged quite strongly in the RFC as well. So that did occur to my mind as well. That would that be a possibility? But then I don't know if we really want to go down that path yet.
Well, you're talking about application namespaces. I'm talking about the namespace just for the conditional attributes, which would not be a surprise and wouldn't clash.
Okay, well, that's one option then. If you really want to go with yeah, if you want to prefix the parameters with something else, but okay.
Christian?
I'd just like to emphasize again that this has been said earlier in these discussions also. The query, a URI query option is a critical option, and in general, an application will not just ignore something just because it doesn't know it, because this is a critical option. The practice of ignoring query parameters has, in my understanding, come from PHP applications just usually not doing this, and a few other implementations of web servers, but that doesn't mean that a client can just make up the URI and add a query parameter and then just hope that it means the same unless the server says otherwise.
Okay. It appears that the queue is closed, Marco. So
Yes, and in the rest of time.
yeah.
We are back right on
So-
time, by the way.
Okay. So so thank you. We will take that on board and then prepare the next version, and we'll take this to the mailing list, perhaps the next interim as well.
What's your timeline for the next version?
As soon as the queue is open, I think I'll put in the next one. So this is now, I think 03 will be perhaps latest before the next interim meeting. Hopefully, I can come there and present the next one.
That'd be great. It's
Yeah.
27th of April, by the way.
Very good. 1 month.
Thank you,
Clock
Bill.
starts ticking now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so we are exactly back on time again, and next presentation is Group ComBis from ESCO. Please go ahead, ESCO.
We do not
Sorry.
hear you.
I have to unmute the two devices. So, hi Marco, good to see you and everyone else in the audience. Yeah, so hope to be at the future IETF meeting, at least one more time, or multiple times, but we'll see. So this is the presentation about group communication for co-op, the group ComBis draft. What I will do is show some examples of recently added content here. So I assume that everyone is roughly familiar with the topic of the draft. So it's basically a normative draft that specifies how to do group communication in co-op and basically adding more content to what was described in the original co-op RFC. Also, particularly security is also added using group OSCORE. All right, so I'll tell you about what happened. So after the last IETF meeting and the interim meeting, we did a lot of work in adding examples. There were also two open GitHub issues for that. So the examples we added are for basically how to encode an application group name within a co-op request to make that more clear. And also for the discovery, there were some unclarities about that. So how to discover co-op groups and application groups directly on the co-op surface. So if you don't have a resource directory available, but you just want to do it using co-op discovery, how would you go about that? So that's kind of illustrated with examples. Basically, a lot of this is application specific, but it's good to have examples for that you know, approximately what you can expect there. Also, a new appendix was added. So these are message exchanges for group communication, just showing typical, group communication flows, like a basic one with observe, and one with blockwise transfer. Second bullet is here, particular change we made was of removing the URI host option to encode a group name. So we initially added it because of a comment in an earlier IETF meeting, but this gave some confusion. And if you want to resolve that, it becomes very complex. So we decided to just remove it. It was a kind of creative use of an existing option to do something else. So that we thought, well, let's not encourage that particular usage. So it's better to just remove it here. Also, lots of text and editorial improvements were done, and now all the open issues are closed. So next is to show some examples from the new version 6 draft. So what we have now. So this is an example for section 221. So that's about name encoding of application groups. And here you see in yellow marked is the application group name and how it is encoded in co-op request, so in the URI and in the actual co-op message options. And the second box is a second example of the same thing, a little bit more compact co-op request in this case. So that's pretty straightforward. There are more examples in the draft. I will now move to the next slide. So it's for another section about discovery. So this was the discovery without resource directory that I mentioned. And the idea here is in this example that you have as input a co-op group, that's a known entity, also marked in red. And a client now wants to discover what are the associated application groups to this and what servers are in it, basically, and also discover the resources that belong to that group. So what you can see here on in the box example is that the request is sent to the co-op group with a query looking for specific resource types that denote a group. So that's in this application specific example, that's the G dot something is the resource type for a group. And as you can see, two servers are returning, responding basically with their groups and marking a particular type of group. So basically this is discovering the like you say, the entry or the root resource of the group. If the client wants to do more resource discovery, so what are the resources within that group, he can just do a second request that's not shown here, but to get more details. Okay, what are the resources within a particular group that are supported? All right, then move on to the next example. So there was the appendix that was added about message exchange. This shows a basic example. So a client sends a multicast co-op request to A, B, and C, and all of those respond with the unicast response. One of them is lost, and there's kind of a special twist in here in this example. You can see that client C is responding from a different port. That is just to illustrate that, yeah, this is kind of allowed behavior as specified by co-op. So for these multicast requests, the source port of the responding server is actually not used in the matching request to responses that happens in the client. So the server could use a different source port, as is shown in this case. Okay, then there's more examples. So I show one more that's a bit more advanced example, much longer. So this is the blockwise option. You can see that in yellow. So there's a block option in the request and also in the responses. So you can see the servers all support it, and we'll send back the first block of the resource that's being requested. In this case, it's a log resource, so you can expect that it can be rather big. On the next slide, that example continues. So now the first block is in. So what does the client do? The client will basically use unicast blockwise transfer to basically go to each of the servers and then fetch the rest of the resource. So that's also shown here. This is all content coming from A. And then the example continues. We'll go to the next slide. That's the same for B. So from B also the content is fetched. So for details, you can also look in the draft. And this basically concludes what I wanted to show here. One more thing, that's the next step. So we don't have any current updates planned. All the issues are closed, and so that's why we think it's now ready for the working group last call to be done at some point for this version 06. But if there are any more issues found, of course, before that, we're happy to work on that as well. Okay, thanks. Any questions?
So there was one observation on the chat that maybe UI host wasn't as bad. So can you maybe quickly recap why this leads to complications?
Yeah, I think the point was the URI host option is also related to the parsing algorithm that co-op defines. So you get as input URI basically, and as output of the parsing you get multiple co-op options. So the argument for including the application group was that basically you do not include it in the group URI, but after the parsing you add in the URI host option. you add it additionally. So it's not included in group URI, and that's the
Yeah,
confusing part.
that's abuse.
Yeah,
Agree.
that's kind of changing the like changing the parsing algorithm almost, or doing something after that, and that's
Okay,
it
let's take it offline.
It gave so many
Okay.
discussions that it's maybe best not to mention it at all. I mean, why would it? It doesn't really help then. Okay, Christian.
Christian, yeah, just so for clarification, the way of naming the group just with the URI host is still fine as long as it's just in the group URI. So if it's in the group URI, that's a way of naming it, but not adding it like
That's right.
sideways. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's still allowed. Yeah, but then it's also because it's in the authority component, it becomes the co-op group also. So that means in that case, the application group and the co-op group are one and the same, and they are identified by the same information item basically. So that's the point. And we wanted to basically encode a different application group name in the URI host option. So that was what makes it confusing. Actually, yeah. Okay. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Esko.
Any reaction from the chair? So what do we do with this
I
request?
leave this to Karsten, of course.
Yeah.
Karsten?
So did you want me to say something about that?
Yeah, we leave to you about the concrete next step to take if you think this is appropriate now.
Well, to me it seems that we are ready for a working classified. So that will alert people to the fact that this spec is done and they should be reading it. So that sounds like a good next step to me.
Great.
Thank you.
Good.
Okay, next presentation is group of score, and it's on me. So, Karsten, if you can drive the slides, that'd be good. At least I move to the presenter mic.
The amount of mouse movement that is needed to do that is amazing. 1 second. Hey, do you see them? Are these the right slides?
Yes, thank you. Okay, this is Marco. This is an update on the latest version of the group of score document. Next slide, please. Right, the document underwent a second working group last call, and based on that, we submitted version 14 for the cutoff. And this was based on 2 reviews we got during the last call from Esko and Ricard. Thank you very much indeed for that. There were very good comments, and Esko's came first in 2 parts. The main actual comments followed by a separate mail with editorial notes. So we worked on those first, and were also object of discussion at an interim. Ricard reviews instead came on the editor's copy produced from processing Esko's review, which was very convenient to finalize the document. Next slide, please. So this is a summary of the main comments from Esko's review that we addressed through different incremental steps. So there was first a proposal of overall direction to take on those on the list. The most controversial, delicate points were discussed at the interim, and it's basically those listed here. So we enforced a clear-cut distinction between authentication credential and public key in terms of terminology and phrasing around those. And then there was also a point about clarifying the trade-off between storage overhead and convenience for storing whole authentication credentials. One very delicate point was about making optional the feature at the group manager to recycle group IDs so that a group can live forever in principle, still in a safe way. And there was especially important to well confine this optional feature in a very self-contained section so that it was clear to be something optional for the group manager to support. So that's all the case now, and exactly about this point, there was a further confirmation on the list. And finally, a number of points related to what was mandatory to implement support and what not, rearrangement of references to be appropriately normative or informative, as the text citing those, and the echo option used for synchronization of sequence number through challenge response moved up to the document body. You find more pointers in the slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this is actually it. We believe that the latest version of the data tracker well addresses the working group law school reviews, and we had actually confirmations about that on the list. We are not aware of any other open point or issue specifically on the GitHub. So we think the work on this document is actually done for a working group, and that it can proceed with the next step, meaning the Shepherd write-up. And after some discussion, we found out that Christian Amsos is available to act as shepherd for this document, that we really appreciate. That's all from my side. Thank you.
So one quick question. What is the web of normative references you are entangled in?
It is group combis, and the COSI documents that hopefully will be published anytime soon. They are in Out 48 for a while now. But except
Okay.
those, if I remember correctly, it's only group combis, and well, those documents have to proceed in parallel anyway, because they are
Right.
mutually referring each other.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, if there's no other question or comment, I think we are done with this topic. Thank you. Okay, and the next presentation is about kudos from Ricard. And from now on, all presenters are on site, by the way.
So you do the slides? No, Ricard does the slides.
Yes, I will share them here from the phone version. Yes. Okay.
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Right. So I will be presenting this draft today, key update for OS Core kudos. And yes, my name is Rickard Höglund. So yes, as a content recap of what this draft actually contains, it has basically two parts, and the general challenge is that OS Core uses these AAD algorithms to provide security. And in order to do things securely, you need to follow a number of limits when it comes to number of encryptions and failed decryptions before you have to rekey the keys that you use for message processing. Because excessive use of the same key can enable breaking security properties of the AAD algorithms. And there's a reference to a document in CFRG at the bottom right, where you can look more into this. And so essentially, this draft has two parts. The first part is about the AAD key usage limits in OS Core, where we define appropriate limits for OS Core for a variety of algorithms. And this basically means that when these limits are reached, you have to rekey the keys that you're using. And we also define like how can you practically have a counter for the key usage? How do you change the message processing compared to vanilla OS Core? and what steps then should you take when the limits are reached. And a recent update here was that we recommended a new set of values for the QVNL for the AS128 CCM8, because that has to be handled separately from the other algorithms, since there the limits has to be lower, basically, to get acceptable probabilities for security. But today, the main focus will really be about the key update for OS core procedure. And this is a procedure that's loosely inspired by the Appendix B2 of OS core. And the goal there is basically that, well, when you reach these limits, then what you want to do is renew the master secret and master salt. And from those, you want to derive a new sender and recipient key. And one good thing about this procedure is that you achieve forward secrecy. And just as a recap on how this actual procedure works, you can see here on the right-hand side the message flow, but the general idea is that the client and server exchanges two nonces, R1 and R2, and then you have this update CTX function, which takes these nonces as input to generate a new score security context. But we extended the OSCOR option to have a place where we can transport these nonces. So now we have defined this bit D, and when that bit is set, there is an ID detail field added to the OSCOR option. So you have the ID detail and you have X, which is the length of the ID detail. But the purpose of the ID detail is essentially to carry these nonces back and forth. And you can see that also to the right-hand side that the ID detail holds the nonces. And now I go into a bit more detail on updates that we did, or additions that we did from the latest version of the draft. So one thing we added based on discussions and feedback and also discussions on the core mailing list is a mode of kudos where you do not have forward secrecy. And the point of this is that you need to be able to support a stateless key update, because if some device loses state, like for instance due to rebooting, and it cannot store information to persistent memory, which may be the case for some constrained devices, it still needs to be able to run a key update procedure. And in fact, the original version, like the Appendix B2 procedure that OSCOR defines, does support this stateless mode of operation. So what we did here was we added an extension to kudos, basically that there is now a way to, by having yet another bit, this P bit, you can indicate if you want to run kudos in the mode with forward secrecy or without forward secrecy. So if this P bit is set to 0, you run it in forward secrecy mode, which is the original mode. And if you are capable of writing to persistent memory, you should use the forward secrecy mode. So the non-forward secrecy mode should really only be used by devices that have to use it because they cannot write to persistent memory. Yeah, so if the P bit is set to 1, then that is an indication you want to run kudos in the no forward secrecy mode. And we defined some concepts related to this. So you have like two sets of key material, basically, like you have the latest master secret and latest master salt. And this is the information from your most recently derived OSCOR security context. And this you should store on disk if you are capable to do so. Then you also have the bootstrap master secret and bootstrap master salt, and this can be information that is pre-provisioned to the device at manufacturing. And this is information that the device itself would never change. Right, and if you want to run kudos in the no forward secrecy mode, basically what the difference between the current definition of kudos that you have is you do this modification that the security context you use as input to derive your new security context. You simply replace the master secret and master salt in that with the bootstrap master secret and bootstrap master salt. So your starting point is always this bootstrap information. And because of that, you sacrifice forward secrecy, but you still have all the other properties for kudos remaining. And now there is a way, like for instance, if one device supports writing to disk and the other device does not support writing to disk, well, the device that takes the initiative, if it can write to disk, it will try to run kudos in the forward secrecy mode, right? So it could be the case that the initiator tries to run it in forward secrecy mode, but the responder is unable to continue. because it cannot practically write to disk, so it cannot remember and store the latest key material. But in this case, we have this agreed downgrading of mode. So basically, if the responder is a server, you return a protected 503 error message with P set to 1 to indicate, yeah, I want to run it in the no forward secrecy mode. And if the client is responder, you can send a protected request to with P set to 1. But basically, if you attempt to run kudos and the other party responds with the P bit set to 1 saying, I want to run it in the no forward secrecy mode, you can simply try yourself with the P bit set to 1. So at least you can run it in common. So you basically have to downgrade to the device that has the least capability. And yeah, here are some open questions if this is a reasonable approach, and if there are any comments, or if this, and now basically we have this in an appendix actually as a suggested way to do this. And so one open question is also if this could be good to move to the draft main body.
Göran?
Yes, Göran Stellander, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'd like to thank the authors for doing this work. I mean, there's plenty of updates here. This is just the first one, and I think this is a really good part that we should keep and move up to the body. I can see many settings where this is useful. You could have, I mean, if you could use this not only for things that are manufacturer set, it could be things like after an imprinting, you could fill this Bootstrap master secret with the result, or it could be the result after an provisioning through the ACE OAuth framework. And it could be used in the reset button setting. So you could, I mean, even if you have both the Bootstrap master secret and the latest master secret fields, you could have a reset button, for example, which means that you pick from the Bootstrap master secret registry, if I understand right. And that, I think it would be really useful. So this gives a lot of options. There's some security considerations here. You obviously need to integrity protect the field, but you're coming to that in the later slide.
Yes.
And also to handle the situations when you have, I mean, there are a number of cases now, P equals 1 and 0, and existence of these, whether you support the Bootstrap master secret or not. I think that's not overly complex, and that's this looks good.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot for the feedback on that. Yes.
Carsten?
Yeah, I also think this is nice work. I have a pretty trivial question. How often can you use your Bootstrap master secret?
Can you repeat how often you can use the Bootstrap master secret?
Yeah, so this is just another key, and there is probably a limit to how often you can use it.
Yeah, we haven't really done any security analysis on that for now, on how many times you can use it until you really have to change also that. But that's, I think that's a good question, something we can think about a bit deeper. Yeah,
so your assumption was you cannot change it, so essentially you have to throw away the device when.
Yeah, I mean, our assumption was, well, let's put it this way, our assumption was that the device itself cannot change it. So like the device itself could not write to itself to change it, but possibly through some manual intervention, some technician may be able to go and change it.
Okay.
And Carsten, I think, and the authors, I think this is not a big problem. I mean, in the sense that, I mean, assume that you have a good entropy of the Bootstrap master secret. And what happens at the key update is just that you add in nonces.
That's true, yeah.
So you shouldn't, I mean, you shouldn't really have a problem as long as the original entropy of the BMS is large enough. It shouldn't. So that I mean, what you say boils down. It falls back to the assumption of the entropy of the secret key.
Yeah, I'm just interested in this because if it's a limited number of times you can use it, then of course it becomes an attack vector for DOS attacks, so you have to be aware of that vector.
Yeah, and there is a limit, yes, but that limit will not be the limiting factor in this.
Great.
Okay, thanks a lot for the discussion. I think I will proceed to the next section then. I don't know how many.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So now another addition we did, and this is also in fact added to an appendix in the draft, is how can we keep observations around? And this has been something we discussed in earlier meetings also. So basically there is a problem that we identified, and that problem is if the client starts an observation, let's call it ops1, by sending a request rec1 with the request PIVX. And then now after that, the two peers run the kudos procedure and reset their sender sequence numbers back to 0. And later on, while this observation is still ongoing, now the client sends a new request, rec2, but this also uses rec PIVX because the client restarted from 0. It's partial IV, its sender sequence numbers. So the problem here is that now a notification sent by the server for the observation 1 or a response to request 2 would both cryptographically match against the request 1 and request 2, essentially because they're using they're using the same request PIV in this case, right? So we needed a way to avoid this accidental use of the request PIV for open observations. So what we do now in Appendix C is we define a method where you do this jumping, we call it long jumping, beyond the partial IVs that are already in use for observations. And more information on this is also on the next slide. And we also now propose to have a new bit B that you can actually use to signal interest if you wish to keep observations or not. And of course, if both parties do not wish to keep the observations, well, you can simply discard them every time you do the rekeying. There's no need then to keep them. But if you wish to keep them, you can indicate it with this bit B. So what is this long jumping method? It's basically that when you want to send a first request after you did the key update, a kudos execution, the client should determine the partial IV as the highest partial IV among all ongoing observations. And the point is that you wish to now set your sender sequence number to that value +1. So you jump beyond this, so there's absolutely no risk that you will be reusing that partial IV that's already occupied for an ongoing observation. But then we identified after some discussion like a sub-issue or related issue to this, which is that to remove ongoing observations, the client needs an explicit confirmation from the server, because otherwise the server may still consider observation to be open. So what do you do if this client cannot get the confirmation? The worst case, these observations would be around forever, and you would always have to jump to a very high sender sequence number or partial IV. However, we now define this epoch counter. So for each ongoing observation, you have an epoch, and when this epoch counter reaches the max epoch, you can both parties delete the observation, and this counter would be incremented every time you do the key update, right? This is like to reduce the risk that you have observations staying around forever and always forcing you to jump far ahead in the PIV space. So in this case, it would be a guarantee that, let's say the max epoch is 3, then after 3 kudos, 3 rekeying executions, you would guarantee to have deleted that observation, and both sides do that. So now the question here is like, for instance, what is a recommended or good value for the max epoch? And we're also, any kind of comment or input on this. And one thing we were thinking about, if it can make sense also to have like a negotiation within kudos where you can mutually agree on the max epoch.
There's Joran in the queue. Joran?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm a little bit skeptical to this. I now have read it a little bit more in detail, so I'm not really sure we should do this at all. But I'll provide, since we're running out of time here, I will not ask those questions now. But I think this is maybe a little bit engineering too much, something that we should first understand if we need to do. So I'll get back on that.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you. Thanks for the input.
Try to take about 5 minutes at most for the remaining part.
Thank you. Yes. So I'll go through it a bit quicker then. So one other thing we added was the ability to renew the sender and recipient IDs on the pairs. So we have this now in Appendix D. And it's basically a procedure where yeah, you say as a pair, okay, I wish to use this recipient ID, and the other party says which new recipient ID it wishes to use. And when you have, then you basically you generate new context based on those new recipient IDs, and you can continue the communication with new recipient IDs on both parties. And this procedure can also be embedded in a Kudos execution or run standalone. So we defined a new option for this. It's just a recipient ID option. Again, the idea is pretty basic. In there, you put what recipient ID you wish to use in the future, and the other party does the same. And here's the message flow. So basically what you can see here is the client starts with a recipient ID of 0. Now in request 1, it includes the recipient ID option indicating 42. In the response, the server indicates that it wishes to use 78. And at the bottom, then you see that both sides have generated new score security context. And now the client, in fact, is using 42 as its recipient ID there, and the server is using 78. So they have actually successfully transitioned to the new values. And again, any feedback, objections, or alternatives is very welcome here.
Göran?
Yeah, again, just a brief one. I think this, I don't see any problem with this, but I haven't seen the compelling use case. That's one comment. And the other comment is that this must only be used when it's protected with a previously established security context. So it's not enough that OSCAR is being used. It has to be previously established security context. But I can
yes, there are some, exactly, like you should also not run it after a reboot, for instance, because yeah, there are some restrictions on safe ways to use this, which I think we also cover in the text. Yeah.
Yeah, then it's not the previously established security context. So that's
exactly right.
That's one reason. Okay, thanks.
Okay, and then I had this final part, which is about, so throughout this draft now, we basically define 3 new bits. One is the ID detail bit itself to signal the inclusion of the ID detail in the OSCAR option. Then we have the no forward secrecy bit P to signal the use of the no forward secrecy mode. And then we have the preserve observations bit B. So now, first of all, the ID detail bit that is placed in the OSCAR option, as you can see there to the right. But then the question comes, okay, where do we put the bits B and P to also provide integrity protection of these bits? So our idea and proposal now is to put this is based on feedback and discussions, and I know Christian gave a lot of input on this. So the idea is to put these bits in the byte X, which is currently the length, the size of the ID detail. So we take 2 bits of the X field to encode these bits B and P. Then we still have 6 bits remaining in X, which is sufficient to describe the size of ID detail. And the point here is also now what we do is we take the X value as input to the key derivation procedure to achieve integrity protection for the B and P bits. Yeah, and then just a quick summary and next step. So what did we do in this version? We suggest now a way to do a key update without forward secrecy, defined in Appendix E. We suggest a method for preserving observations across key updates, suggested in Appendix C. And we also suggest a procedure to update the OSCOR sender and recipient IDs defined in Appendix D. We propose some alternative placement for the signaling bits. Then we did some general improvements in the message processing, and also another thing I didn't really cover. We have documented an optimized way of storing the count Q variable, which is basically related to the limits that you have to count the amount of times you use a particular key. That's in Appendix B. And yeah, our plan is basically to address open points and issues. We have a number of issues on GitHub, and feedback is very welcome. We also want to move the suggestion we have added now to the main document body, of course, taking any feedback into account. And yeah, then we also want to basically do an implementation on this based on an implementation of OSCOR we have in the Java Californium library. So thank you. And any comments or questions are welcome.
Seeing none in the queue, nothing in the chat. In the interest of time, unless there are very compelling points to raise now, I think it's pretty clear how to proceed.
Yeah.
That's Christian.
Oh, yeah.
No.
But we can continue discussion on list or
Definitely.
otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricard. And the next is Christian with transport indication.
Can you hear me both slides?
Yeah, I had to clear up.
Hello,
Ricard
everyone.
first.
My name is Christian Amsus, and I would like to, I think transport indication is next.
There you are.
Oh, that's sorry, I picked the wrong one. Yeah, okay, protocol indication. That's the right one. Okay, what I'd like to do here today is give you a brief summary on the topic, because we've talked a lot during interims and gone into details there. But I think what will be helpful for today is to talk about what this is and why this needs to be done, and what are the challenges and solutions. Conveniently, the Secretariat has been providing these small badges, and this roughly sums up what this draft is about. That is, everything before the authority in the component of co-op URI might have different values. So the typical examples that we see are co-op over UDP and co-op over TCP, but really this applies just as well to co-op over WebSockets and any of those transports that have been around in drafts, be it co-op over serial, SMS, Bluetooth. And there are a few ideas around of people who want to do it over quick, and that might be done through taps. So maybe keep an eye open for that. I'll be talking about UDP and TCP primarily as placeholders here. So the thing is, the way, if you look at a device that is concretely implemented, what you usually see is that it has a few resources in there, say an LED and the firmware, and provides different transports. But what on the URI level it actually is the one comes in through co-op over TCP, that's co-op plus TCP : / authority component, and then some resources.
Christian, please don't go away from your microphone,
Yes.
or grab it.
My
You can take
apologies.
it.
I'll just point to the right half of things. Right. Okay. And so these are distinct URIs, and of course, a server may implement things that this server, or this firmware over here and this firmware over there is really the same thing, and most servers do that. But at least from the URI definitions, this does not follow. So we might need to indicate what actually what the situation is, and whether a client may just, when it is doing co-op over UDP, switch over to TCP and continue on the same resource. Now, something we could do is to define that just for a particular set of servers, just to define that for particular protocols, these are the same thing. It is generally discouraged in the context of URIs because they might previously not have been, and there are a few other problems, like there could be cache entries that need to be aligned to that. What does it mean for security? What does it mean? Kind of how identical can two things be if they are not accessed the same way? And last but not least, this would be a breaking change, because existing implementations can already distinguish between the same resource as accessed through UDP or through TCP. So the current proposal is to not unify these, but rather to provide access to the resources on one side on one protocol through the other protocol. And conveniently, co-op already gives us all the tools we need for that, because there is the proxy scheme option, and if a device is accessed with a query with a request that includes that option, the URI host option still has the same default value that it has already. That is the IP address and possibly the port of the previous request. And if they are as neatly aligned as co-op over UDP and co-op over TCP are, that is, they have a host name and they have a port, and that's usually the same one, then not even that URI host needs to be expressed. So a client that wants to access the firmware resource over co-op over TCP can just already do this in principle by just adding the proxy scheme option and then asking the device to act as a proxy to the resources that are even on the same device, which sounds like a lot. I mean, we have to add proxy functionality, but really what it is the device must be prepared to ignore that option as long as it implements the same resources on both protocols. So reads like a lot, but really what it is simple to implement and just adding a few bytes on the wire. The suggested mechanism for advertising this is using web links, which we already use for discovering and advertising anything else. We probably don't want to advertise the availability of the proxy per resource, because that would mean that if we have 15 resources, we advertise 15 different statements. So instead, it would be advertised once per server. And following the links that we already have, the statement could be, if anything is linked from that root resource, which in practice things are because of the implicit rules of RFC 6690, then you may follow that additional link to find a proxy and use that proxy. Now, a proxy is a co-op service, basically mapped to a socket somewhere, whereas all the things we can talk about in web linking are URIs. So, and we don't have a particular URI scheme that identifies a service running on a particular port. The terminology, which was sharpened thanks to Klaus's input, is now such that we still talk about URIs. So this green box is replaced with an actual URI indicating the root resource of that server. But the predicate used there says that this is pointing to a URI, and what it actually means is put the transport and the protocol out of that and use that. So far, this addresses the first two goals. That is, we introduce a mechanism that allows discovery, and the other is that we don't add URI aliasing to a world in which it was not taken for granted so far. By the way, if you have questions, I think now would be a good, yeah, okay. Now might be a good time, because, okay, I can't go back here, because this is like the basic groundwork. Otherwise, I'll just continue on to the next part here. That is
Esko in the queue, actually,
Oh,
with a question.
I didn't see him.
Go ahead, Esko.
Esko, please.
Yeah, just a question on this proxy statement. So when would that be included if you do discovery? So it's like every time you ask for anything, it adds a proxy statement, or do you have to ask specifically for something to get the proxy?
This is so far not precisely described. My rough expectation would be that it is done whenever there is something that looks like initial discovery, but might warrant a few more words. So especially with servers that provide a lot of different transports, it can well make sense to narrow this down. I'll take that as an input for an updated version. To say something about which proxying statements make sense to send unprompted, and whether and how a client might express interest in them. There is providing. So there are a few words on how a client can ask for them explicitly, but especially with the lookup defined in 6690 and used also for resource directory, that is really an extra query step. With Coral, things might be a bit easier, but then again, we don't have the Coral query format specified yet, so that might be selling things that we haven't even really hunted yet.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I see also a use case here for clients that do co-op discovery and get a big list of co-op S resources back. So if you use this statement and the client understands it at least, then you can make the list shorter overall by removing lots of overhead. But that's only in link format, I think. Probably not in Coral.
That's generally good input. Thank you. I'll take it for the next document version. So of course, this has security implications. And I like to say that it's just really another proxy. There is, of course, a bit more to it, but I think that's a gist you should take. So if a proxy is advertised this way, the general expectation of the client should be that the proxy can still provide credentials for whatever the original service was. So there would be no downgrade of security. There are, of course, this works really well and transparently if OSCORE is used. This also works for TLS-based connections, as long as that proxy is, as I've been describing it so far, really on the same device. So if the same device just opens a TLS port in addition to a DTLS port, it would just provide the same certificates there. If someone wants to use advertised proxies over TLS that are not on the same device, that's pretty much out of scope for this document because it is very complicated and probably not worth encouraging. There is, of course, the case of traffic misdirection. So even if, for example, with OSCORE, the connection is secure in terms of what OSCORE provides, such a proxy could still be advertised to make the client send its data up around another services, so that service goes up through attacker, so the attacker at least sees the traffic pattern. The latest version now has a few words on that, among other things, saying that, yeah, if you want to protect against that, you better also use DNSSEC and look at what routing advertisements you take, because if you don't watch for that, you might wind up in the same situation. But basically, it's up to the application which requirements to place on the statement, because the fundamental security properties are already upheld by the requirement that the proxy still needs to provide good credentials. Now, so far, this resolves the long-standing issue of reconciling the various co-op plus something schemes. And maybe that's enough. And maybe we just want to look into a few more things that the document also provides. In particular, that someone else might provide that proxy service, for example, a resource directory that allows cross-proxying between co-op and co-op plus TCP connections, and also that we still send a few bytes more. So on the proxying side, this is rather straightforward, because generally this statement can be produced by any other party, in particular those that are in the discovery path. And the rest is really up to the security requirements of the application. The line on proxy usability, I won't say much more other than, yeah, of course, if there are clients, or if there are proxies already in this whole game, things will still keep working. On the topic of optimizing away those additional bytes that we might have on the wire, there is a specialization of that option that says that the host is generally not doing any name and protocol-based virtual hosting. If the host advertises this property, then the client can just do away with that proxy scheme option that it would otherwise have to send. Looks a bit like aliasing on the wire. I prefer to think of it as an agreed on compression. Basically similar to SHIC, because we establish a context, although not statically, but dynamically. And that context then says there is an implication that URI host and URI, that proxy scheme and URI host are always that, but the security implications are a bit harder to manage, and there's still ongoing exploration on that, which probably boils down to such statements only being acceptable when they come from the original source, which might be, which is probably okay. So to summarize, I think it's not too hard to get all of this going, especially because most of the options that we need are already there. We can do this without breaking the general rules of the web, that is, do not just introduce URI aliasing. Yep, and I think it can and should be done. The question is, what am I missing? And is this something that should go through this working group?
Thank you. Any comment? Question? Carsten?
Yeah, chair head off. The answers are yes and yes.
Esko? Esko, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah, I was just thinking doing it in this working group sounds good, and it might require indeed yeah, a document to clarify that use of the proxy option. So yeah, sounds useful at least to do it in this way.
Thank you. Chair off. Yes and yes from my side too, anyway. Okay, I'd just like to have a first feeling from the room and ask a usual question. We can use the raise hands tool. So I'm going to ask who thinks the draft is ready for working group adoption. Raise hand if agree.
Yeah, there also was a comment from the chat. Ari said
Right.
he needs a solution and the presented solution looks good.
Okay, there's 10 raise hand and 0 do not raise hand for the minutes. We'll confirm this to the list. I think we can literally go for a confirmation of adoption considering this. Of course, any further feedback is welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, having eaten 5 minutes from flex time, we are still good on time, I think, and you can move on with the next presentation, Christian.
Yep. So this next slot is about non-traditional responses, where I've recently joined the whose author team I recently joined. And again, I'd like to start with kind of setting out the problem space here. That is that without defining what it is, we've had a few variations on how responses come in to CoAP request. So the simple thing that happens at least in my application, like 99% of requests, is that there is a single request and there's one response. And if that response is retransmitted, the retransmitted version might be slightly different, but the client still processes only one response. Now, multicast has been around from the start, which means that there are different responses coming in from different source addresses. Observation was part of CoAP almost from the beginning, indicate which allows the server to send more than one response over time. And then a few documents explored how else responses could come in. So for example, CoAP over SMS was, to my knowledge, the first document that described that there could be something like triangular requests, where you send a request from the client to the server over SMS, but also indicate that you would pretty please want the response sent over UDP down to that particular address, which would be indicated in the request. And that was taken up later in core responses. The endpoint ID draft that was around, I think, around 2017, had options for observations that changed the server's address. So then again, a later response would come in from an address that the client wasn't originally expecting it from. And more recently, the multi-blocks RFC and the proxying for group communication draft use mechanisms by which a client can tell the server that it is really okay to send a few responses as long as the regular flow control, which is unaffected by any of this, is upheld, and that the client would be willing to receive a particular set of messages. What they all have in common is that the responses arrive on the same token. And I think it makes sense to call all of these non-traditional responses, because in all of these cases, something comes back that was not requested precisely like that through precisely that channel. So the definition that is now in the responses draft is that a non-traditional response is a response that is not the single response that was generated for a request that was received on the same transport. In particular, that means if there's one response to a request that is non-traditional, all responses are non-traditional, but there might be one that is standing out, not necessarily by anything the transport provides, because any additional response just looks like the others, but quite possibly only one response matches the request in some sense, because the others might have, say, options that clearly deviate from what is okay to respond with. So there's an additional definition, and looking at it now, I might want to flip terminology to not have too many negations in there, but a matching response is one that works well for the original request and has no options that make it incompatible. So for example, if, and that is what's been using in the blockwise request, blockwise RFC, new blocks, sorry, 9177, is that a request is sent for a particular block, and one of the many responses that come back, one response is indicating that particular block again, and the others just include block options for later blocks or earlier blocks, but blocks that are clearly not that one. So the document as it is now does a few things that could all be useful on their own, and anticipating the next slide, this is what we'll need a bit of guidance for. One thing is it provides terminology. So right now, every document that somehow introduces non-traditional responses has to reiterate on the topics of tokens, has to say again that, and by the way, flow control of this is all still as in RFC 7252 or any extensions to flow control, and cons and nons work as they always have. So this document could provide terminology for this, and there are two concrete drafts where I think it would be very useful to pivot over to this, provided this is something that this is a direction we continue going in. Same goes for implementations. So I've seen implementations of observation of varying quality in different implementations, and these often don't work well together with, for example, multicast. And if there is a general concept of non-traditional responses and how these work, I think that this can also go into implementations, and they would then just say that we are expecting several responses. Client implementers, please provide your hooks in case a non-traditional response comes in, or tell the stack how it's handled in this particular case, without the need for the stack to implement down every one of them and their combinations. The current draft also defines a few options. For example, one by which your client can generally request several more responses over some time. So that's a fourth bullet here. These options could be by applications, and the draft also describes that there could be pre-configured requests, which means that there are no added options. It's just client and server agree on a particular set of configuration values, and then those responses are just sent based on the terminology established here.
We have Karsten in the queue. Karsten?
Yeah, I just have one more item for the list. Since our security models need to be able to bind responses to requests. We need to understand how the security models are impacted, or on the other hand, to provide guidance for the security models to handle how to handle these responses.
Yes, very much, yes. Okay, so the questions that we'd like to ask is, A, are non-traditional responses something that this working group is interested in working in general? And then B, if it is this document taking the right approach? So do we provide concepts that are useful? Do we provide options that are useful? Do you want to keep all of that in? Apart from the interest topic, there's also the question of, do we conflict with anything? So far, I've compared this against everything I found that did multiple responses, and I think it's matching pretty well, but we might have overlooked something. And so this is something that I would like to have checked. And then the remaining question is basically AOF, any other feedback? So yeah, thanks for your attentions. I would be very glad to hear questions on this, on feedback.
Any question, comments? Let's go.
Yeah, I think these are good questions. I find them difficult to answer at this moment, but I wanted to ask one question from the implementer perspective. So you propose that by introducing this concept of non-traditional response, that it would improve also the software quality in that way, yeah? But because the stack would have a sort of catch-all function or callback or whatever for the non-traditional response case, if
Yes.
it doesn't know how to handle it otherwise. Yeah.
So the stack would still need to be, so what right now happens is the stack needs to be aware of the full semantics of all the non-traditional response options. So
Yeah.
it needs to handle the proxy, the multicast proxy option needs to handle observation. And with that terminology, the stack could just have a list of options with their respective rules of how many responses or how long responses come in, without necessarily having to implement all the nitty-gritty details, and can leave some of that to the application.
Okay, well, still need to think about that, but that sounds useful at least, so it's more prepared for the future in a way, if more things will be defined in the future.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Marco Cherhetov. I've read the last two versions of the draft, and I plan to give out a review anyway. I couldn't see any conflict really with other documents, and actually I think it's good to have a single framework as reference point for terminology, taxonomy, and concepts that are already used here and there anyway, and otherwise we risk dialects of this concept to develop and so on, and just create confusion.
Thank you. Hank, was that a question or were you just stretching?
No,
Looks like chatting going on.
Okay, so I suppose we will see a next version posted anytime soon, or in the next few months.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
So could we have a show of hands for the first question?
Say it again, Carsten.
Could we have a show of hands for the first question?
Indeed.
Will you type that or do I type that?
I'm typing.
Good. And of course, my next question while you are still typing would be, who would be interested to review such a document? So just type in the chat if you could help reviewing that.
So I'm going to ask, is the working group interested in general work on non-traditional responses? Raise hand if agree. And just confirming in the chat, I'm interested to review. So the poll says 9 raise hand, 0 do not raise hand, 10 raise hand. Okay, let's wait a few seconds more. 10 raise hand, and 0 do not raise hand for the minutes. Okay, thank you. And for the minutes, also Yola in the chat said he can review this document and also ESCO at some point. There's a comment from David Navarro in the chat. I'm kind of discovering this respond to star options. They look like a vector for DOS attacks. Should the document address it?
Yes, that's the security considerations.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Last but not least, Martin about DNS over co-op.
Okay. Yeah, I'm talking about DNS queries over co-op, together with and also representing my other co-authors which are on this slide right now. Yeah, first want to talk, of course, a little bit about the concept, then update you on what we did since the last time we spoke in this working group, which was an interim last year. Then show some of our preliminary evaluation we did on the various DNS transports we could use, and then go over into the discussion where I want to discuss a new content format, caching options, if we need to account for observe or so-called server push if we take the HTTPS lingo, and the question of how abstract the draft should be or how concrete. Yeah, for the motivation, basically, we just want to protect against eavesdropping when doing DNS requests with IoT devices. And of course, the usual way to do it is to encrypt the name resolution. And basically, there are already some solutions for that, of course, which is DNS over HTTPS, DNS over TLS. Then newly added, there's DNS over QUIC and DNS over DTLS. But all of these have problems when it comes to the IoT. The first two, of course, use TCP, which conflicts with some of our resource constraints we face in the constrained IoT. DNS over QUIC has similar problems when it comes to that. And DNS over DTLS has the so-called path MTU problem, which is even amplified when it comes to constrained link layer PDUs, like the ones we face in 802.15.4 or lower one. So our proposal is to do DNS over co-op. We can then use the encrypted communication based on DTLS or OSCORE, use the blockwise message transfer to overcome the PathMTU problem, and also share the system resources with co-op applications, so we can basically save some memory by using the same buffers and sockets, and also reuse the co-op retransmission mechanism. And we basically just do that by putting the DNS query in a co-op request fetch, and that is then issued to a doc server. That one can then basically just get the information either from a local storage or another DNS server, and then respond in a co-op response, also encoded as in a DNS response. Yeah, since last time we spoke here, we basically removed the originally proposed get and post method, which came basically from DOH. We put a little bit of thought into how caching and cache validation is done with the e-tags. We also added DOQ as another consideration and why it conflicts with constrained IoT scenarios. We clarified how our content format is and accept is handled, and also did a lot of to be done's by mostly just saying that they're out of band, for example, the server selection, but also put some consideration on how messages that are too big, basically DNS messages that are too big, should be handled by a DOC server. And yeah, and also added some considerations on how to use DNS over co-op with, or why to use DNS over co-op with an unencrypted connection, and why it might be also beneficial. For our evaluation, we basically first looked into what is there on DNS traffic in the IoT and basically made an empirical data set of that to get some idea what name properties and resource records are there. We then did that, used that information to do some experiments in a testbed with 2 clients, which request a name from a resolver via a forwarder and a border router. The clients basically just query 50 A or AA, quad A records for a name of length 24. We do this over UDP, DTLS, co-op, co-ops, and OSCORE. And yeah, basically these 50 queries are done around 5 queries per second in a Poisson distributions. Of course, this completely ignored the end start requirement, which is outlined in 7252. But we wanted to see the network basically in a constrained manner, so we get some interesting data. And yeah, we did 10 runs with that on Cortex M3 nodes with an 802.15.4 radio. And basically, we got the following resolution times, which we plotted here as a cumulative distributive function. And we basically see 3 groups types of communication. So this is basically group 1, this one on the top, which is just UDP for A records. Group 2, which is co-op and UDP, and co-op for post and fetch, and UDP for the quad A records. And then this other, basically the whole rest is this group 3. And the question, of course, is where do these performance groups come from? And when we look at the packet sizes, we get basically our answer, because the group 1 is basically where no message fragmentation is happening. Group 2 is where the query is unfragmented and the response is fragmented. And the group 3 is basically where both query and response are fragmented. So our conclusion of that is that when it comes to performance, basically the fragmentation has a far larger impact compared to transport or co-op methods. And I guess this is not a big surprise for most of you. But our conclusion from that is basically that we need a new content format other than the normal wire format for DNS over co-op, because even with the most realistic query and response sizes, we see fragmentation even when we just take our minimal name lengths of 2. The response for a quad A record already gets fragmented. And so, yeah, basically we want to have some kind of compression basically to get below that number. And some ideas we put forward for that, not yet in our draft, but to discuss here, is to basically omit the authority and additional sections of the DNS response, omit the QD field because QD count fields, because the question section is always of length 1. Most resolvers even just throw away any query that has more than one question in it. Then make the class and type optional and basically imply the most requested ones, which are hopefully soon in and quad A. Currently it's more in and A, but yeah, we hope that will change in the future. Then use self-delimiting numeric values, like we of course, for example, have in the co-op options or CBOR for all the numeric values, and maybe even make the question option completely optional, because requests are most oftentimes bound to their responses, so we basically already know what the question was when we get a response. And basically, we propose two options here, which we haven't clearly decided yet on, which is basically putting the question, putting it in a CBOR array, and put the question in a CBOR array and the answer section in a CBOR array of arrays, or use this what we call a remote get address by name, where we basically just put the name that we want to query into the request, maybe also a type, and then basically expect an address as a response. But in general, this probably should be discussed in a separate draft.
There is Karsten in the queue.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Karsten.
Yeah, just a quick question. What is the percentage of the space that is taken by the actual labels here?
By the what?
By the labels, the DNS names?
Well, it's always these, most of the time, it's basically the number of characters plus 2 bytes for the delimiting characters. So yeah, it's oftentimes really a small part of that, especially when you look at the name lengths. I have a slide in my backup slides, which I don't want to scroll forward to because this Meet Echo thing is a little bit.
Okay, I look it up there.
But I can show you at the end, maybe if there's time.
Yeah, because we could come up with a much more efficient encoding of LDH labels, which are probably the majority of the labels that we are looking at here.
Yeah. Okay. Then the other discussion we want to basically open is that we have basically currently 2 proposals for how to handle caching and the max age option and DNS TTLs, which all use relative values, and so they might get out of sync at caching proxies. In the DOH RFC, basically there's a proposal just use the minimum TTLs as the freshness, which would equate in co-op to the max age option. And then the clients basically need to figure out how to do the TTLs. And basically this would mean that you basically look for the smallest TTL. And if that is not the same as the max age, just subtract them and calculate the TTL from that. That, of course, and the other option would be to do it also like DOH, but then adapt the TTLs already at the server. So basically the minimum TTL is 0 and everything else is just the difference from that. And then the client basically just needs to readapt this based on the max age. If we do this, it looks at this in detail. So basically we get our response at the doc server, see the TTLs, get the minimum TTL of the DNS response and put it into our co-op header. That then is sent via a cache which stores the response, and we wait some time. Then when we query the next time, we basically find it on our cache. And of course, the max age now has decreased and differs from the minimum TTL. So we need to somehow adapt this. And basically, this solution aims to be mostly just compatible with DOH. So if, for example, the doc server is a DOH proxy. And the other option would be the adapting TTL I already talked about, which basically then subtracts all the TTLs with the max age option. And then we do the same thing again at the client. We see the max age option, just add it to all the TTLs. We basically are already done. So we put mostly the workload on the server, which in this scenario is assumed to be the more powerful node. And also we have less cache invalidation because even if the TTLs change in the responses we get from some upstream DNS server, assuming they are always the same amount of time apart, we don't change the content of the response. So if the content, if the ETAG is, for example, based on hashing the content, then we basically don't invalidate our cache. We can just get a valid response from the DOC server from the core proxy. Okay, and then the second to last thing to maybe to discuss is the section 5.3, which talks about observe and server push in HTTP2, which is basically based on this DOH section, which is about to how that maybe the response to the potentially next request could be delivered to a client and then cached by them. With core, someone could think maybe that the name could be of the core RD could be requested and then basically also deliver the well-known core of the core RD. But all in all, this would require that core puts somehow the request information in the notification, or so we get back to this non-traditional DNS responses thing. So that the client basically knows where to cache and for what to cache this response that it got just out of the blue. And another use case of observe specifically was that there's DNS stateful operations, but there's also the question if this is even needed by just some stub resolver or doc client. Yeah, and the last thing basically is how abstract the draft should be. Klaus Hartke there put an issue in our issue tracker, and he basically proposes that that we just specify a REST API that the server then serves, how to retrieve the DNS information, and leave all the protocol details to the implementation. So yeah. Maybe if there are not yet any questions or people need to think about, I can show what Carsten was asking about. Oh.
There are 4 more minutes to go.
Okay.
So,
Yeah. Then, yeah. So basically, here I resolved all the layers by all the packets by layer, and you see for the minimal format there is, I mean. There's basically these 4 bytes, but they are part of a bigger DNS response because, of course, also the quad A record itself is in it, like the IP address. But maybe we can also compress that somehow if it's a known prefix or something like that. There's a question or someone in the queue?
Loren in the queue, and after him, Esco.
Thank you for your presentations. This is very interesting. Do you focus only on IP address, A and quad A, or you are all the record that are described?
Well, at the moment we are focusing on quad A because that was what we saw in our data set was the most requested stuff. Actually, if you don't account for MDNS, it's basically the only record we saw, or the A record, to be honest. But we, of course, want to also support other kind of records.
Okay,
thank you.
Esco?
Yeah, so I had thought because you mentioned observe, and I think one particularly interesting technology is the DNS push approach. So you do a query and the server pushes updates to you over TCP or TLS normally, whenever there's a change. Yeah, so that seems very suitable to just apply observe to it, and I guess you already consider that.
Yeah, but I think that's basically what RCA 8490 is talking about. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's 8765 is also
okay.
notifications. And that's, for example, used also by embedded devices. I'm working on those kind of solutions where actually they will query for services, so using DNS SD type of queries and getting responses, and those are also updated whenever there's a change. So whenever a new device comes online, the device can be notified, like, hey, there's this new service online. And that's using basically the DNS push, so directly over TLS. But I think it could also be mapped to do the same thing with observe very well.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, that's why we put it in there, because we were wondering if there is some use case to have observed. If then maybe some adaptation are needed to it, but from what I hear, basically it's basically just the normal observe. So yeah, maybe we put an option in there and say it's for DNS push, or maybe we don't. Yeah, that also, I guess, depends a little bit on the direction the approach will take in the future.
Yeah, okay. So indeed, the use case is there, but I think what technology exactly is going to be used, yeah, that's still the question, of course. But
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So it looks like you know what to do. I could count kind of 4 main topics or tracks to be more explored. If it's useful, you can even start 1 thread each on the mailing list to get more specific feedback.
Yeah.
On those. Otherwise, it's definitely material for discussions and interim meetings.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So.
Yeah, and please, if you are interested in reviewing versions of this draft, please send a message to the chat so we can gauge the interest in that.
Thomas says he's interested to review. By the way, he was thanking you and co-authors for the nice work and presentation.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. We are exactly on top of the hour. Just to mention again that we resume interim meetings on April 27, bi-weekly as usual. Unless there's any big compelling comment anyone wants to make, I think we can adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much for your participation and work.
okay.
Thank you to the presenters. This was a great meeting.
Thank you. Bye-bye.